Alice Silverthorne was born in 1972 in Chicago, Illinois, into a family whose wealth derived from timber operations in Wisconsin and rail-linked lumber distribution throughout the upper Midwest. She is remembered today as a Chicago heiress, associated with one of the more unusual episodes of Gilded Age private excess, the decision to raise a lion inside her North Side mansion. But before she became known in local newspapers for keeping an exotic animal in a residential neighborhood, before her name appeared in discussions about urban safety and privilege, she was the daughter of a disciplined lumber investor whose fortune was built through land acquisition, sawmill contracts, and post-Great Fire reconstruction demand. Her life unfolded alongside Chicago's transformation into a national industrial center, shaped by inheritance law, trust management, and the culture of elite display that characterized the late 19th century. Before we begin, please comment where in the world you are watching from. I would like to know how far this history is traveling. Henry Silverthorne began establishing the foundation of his fortune in the decade following the Civil War, when demand for construction materials expanded rapidly across the Midwest. Born in 1838 in upstate New York, he relocated to Wisconsin in 1861 as pine harvesting intensified along the Chippewa River. Lumber extraction during that period was closely tied to rail expansion and river transport networks, both of which allowed timber to reach rebuilding markets in Illinois. Silverthorne did not operate as a labor contractor in the forests. Instead, he acquired partial interests in logging tracts and entered into supply agreements with sawmill operators who processed white pine for shipment south. By the mid-1860s, Chicago had become a primary destination for Wisconsin lumber. Rail corridors connecting Milwaukee, Madison, and Chicago increased shipping speed and reduced spoilage. Silverthorne capitalized on this infrastructure by securing freight contracts through the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. The arrangement provided predictable distribution access. When the Great Chicago Fire occurred in 1871, demand for building materials surged immediately. Reconstruction efforts required enormous volumes of framing timber, flooring planks, and structural beams. Silverthorne's existing supply relationships positioned him to meet that demand without delay. The fire altered the scale of his operations. Within 2 years, profits from reconstruction contracts enabled him to diversify beyond forest holdings. Property records from Cook County show that in 1873 he began purchasing residential lots on Prairie Avenue, an area increasingly associated with industrial wealth. These acquisitions signaled a strategic shift. Rather than remain dependent solely on timber extraction, he reinvested earnings into urban real estate tied to Chicago's industrial growth. Rental income from these properties created an additional layer of financial stability. The timing of this diversification proved consequential. The Panic of 1873 disrupted national credit markets and forced many overextended investors into liquidation. Silverthorne's exposure to speculative rail stock remained limited. His principal assets were tangible: timberland, processed lumber inventory, and income-producing property. This conservative allocation shielded him from the most severe losses. While lumber prices fluctuated, reconstruction in Chicago continued at a sustained pace through the latter half of the decade. By the late 1870s, his business structure had evolved into a coordinated system. Timber rights in Wisconsin supplied contracted mills. Finished lumber traveled by rail into Illinois. Urban property holdings generated lease revenue independent of timber cycles. This integration reduced vulnerability to seasonal volatility. It also increased overall capital reserves. Census documentation from 1880 reflects a household staffed with domestic employees, indicating a transition into upper-income social standing. Silverthorne's financial approach reflected patterns common among upwardly mobile industrial investors in the 19th century. He avoided public corporate leadership roles and maintained limited political visibility. Instead, he relied on private contracts and land ownership. This reduced exposure to reputational risk and speculative pressure. By the time his daughter Alice was born in 1972 in Chicago, The family had moved firmly into the city's established elite class. The significance of these early decisions became clear over time. Timber extraction created the initial capital, rail infrastructure expanded distribution. Reconstruction demand accelerated profits. Real estate investment stabilized long-term income. Each development followed directly from prior choices. The result was a durable estate capable of supporting future generations without immediate reliance on active management. This foundation shaped the environment into which Alice Silverthorne was born. She did not inherit a volatile frontier enterprise. She inherited a diversified portfolio built through disciplined reinvestment and geographic strategy. The family's ascent was not abrupt or speculative. It was incremental, structured, and documented through property deeds, freight agreements, and probate filings. These records established the economic conditions that would later allow discretionary decisions removed from necessity. By the close of the 19th century's third quarter, the Silverthorne fortune rested on coordinated assets across state lines. The structure proved resilient during economic contraction and adaptable during expansion. This financial stability would later influence the choices made within the Chicago residence that became central to Alice Silverthorne's public identity. Alice Silverthorne was born in 1972 in Chicago, Illinois, at a time when the city was consolidating its position as a national industrial center. Her early childhood coincided with continued reconstruction following the Great Chicago Fire and the steady expansion of rail terminals, grain exchanges, and manufacturing corridors along the Chicago River. The Silverthorne residence on Prairie Avenue placed the family among industrialists, meatpacking executives, and transportation investors whose wealth was tied to the same infrastructure that supported Henry Silverthorne's lumber contracts. Census records from 1880 list multiple domestic servants in the household, including a cook, 2 housemaids, and a carriage driver. These records indicate a structured domestic environment rather than a transitional or speculative household. Alice's upbringing occurred within a setting that emphasized formal education, supervised social exposure, and controlled mobility within elite circles. Private tutors were retained to instruct her in arithmetic, reading, and French, a language considered essential for social refinement among upper-income families in the late 19th century. Chicago's population growth during the 1870s and 1880s shaped the broader context of her childhood. Immigration from Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia increased labor supply for rail yards and factories. At the same time, residential segregation by income became more visible. Prairie Avenue evolved into a corridor associated with established wealth, while industrial labor districts expanded south and west of the central business area. Alice's daily experience reflected this geographic separation. Her schooling and social visits remained confined to families of similar economic standing. In 1885, Henry Silverthorne acquired additional property further north as elite residential patterns began to shift away from areas increasingly bordered by commercial activity. This relocation reflected a broader movement among affluent Chicago families seeking distance from industrial congestion. The transition also indicated continued financial growth. Property deeds from Cook County confirmed the purchase of a larger residence with expanded grounds and carriage access. The move provided additional privacy and reinforced the family's social position. Education for young women of her class during this period focused on cultural literacy rather than professional preparation. Alice attended a private academy that emphasized literature, music, and etiquette. Archival school catalogs from the late 1880s outlined curriculum standards that aligned with these expectations. There is no evidence that she pursued formal university study, which remained uncommon for women of her social position during that period. Instead, preparation centered on household management and philanthropic involvement. Social life in Chicago's upper tier relied heavily on introductions, calling cards, and organized receptions. By the late 1880s, Alice had begun appearing in society columns, documenting formal gatherings and charitable events. These brief notices demonstrate early integration into established networks. they also reflect the importance placed on visibility within controlled environments. Reputation during this era depended on adherence to predictable norms of conduct. The stability of the Silverthorne estate shaped Alice's adolescence. There was no documented financial crisis within the household prior to the national downturn of 1893. Income from timber interests and rental properties remained consistent. Household expenditures included domestic staff wages, carriage maintenance, and imported furnishings. These records indicate steady liquidity rather than speculative spending. By the end of the 1880s, Alice Silverthorne had reached adulthood within a structured and insulated environment. Her upbringing reflected the disciplined asset management initiated by her father. It also embedded her within Chicago's expanding elite community. These formative years established the financial security, social expectations, and institutional connections that would define her later decisions. Henry Silverthorne died in 1893 during a period of national financial instability, triggered by railroad bankruptcies and constrained credit markets. The Panic of 1893 disrupted investment flows across the United States and led to widespread business contraction. At the time of his death, Silverthorne's estate consisted of timber holdings in Wisconsin, long-term freight agreements, and multiple income-producing properties in Chicago. Probate proceedings were filed in Cook County that same year, initiating formal distribution under Illinois inheritance law. Alice Silverthorne, then 21 years old, became a primary beneficiary under a structured trust arrangement. The will did not dissolve the estate into liquid assets. Instead, it preserved the underlying property and timber interests while authorizing trustees to distribute controlled annual income. This structure reflected common estate planning practices among upper-income families in the late 19th century. The arrangement ensured financial continuity without exposing principal assets to immediate division or speculative reinvestment. The timing of the inheritance was significant. The panic had reduced liquidity in national markets, but tangible assets such as timberland and rental property retained intrinsic value. Silverthorne's diversified holdings limited exposure to rail stock collapses that affected other investors. Trustees retained oversight of lumber contracts and urban leases, maintaining predictable revenue streams. This stability insulated Alice from the direct consequences of the downturn. Illinois law during that period permitted unmarried women to retain independent control over inherited income. Unlike earlier decades when property management frequently transferred to male guardians, statutory reforms in the 19th century expanded financial autonomy for female beneficiaries. Alice therefore exercised direct authority over discretionary expenditures while trustees protected the principal estate. This legal framework positioned her differently from many women in previous generations. Estate ledgers from the mid-1890s show consistent dividend payments derived from rental agreements along Chicago's expanding commercial corridors. Timber revenues fluctuated moderately, but remained positive due to ongoing construction demand. Trustees reinvested a portion of surplus income into additional property acquisitions, strengthening the portfolio during a period when land prices temporarily softened. The strategy emphasized preservation rather than expansion. The inheritance also altered Alice's public standing. Society columns increasingly referenced her as an independent heiress rather than as the daughter of a lumber investor. Invitations to philanthropic committees expanded. Her financial autonomy reduced reliance on marriage as an economic necessity, a factor that distinguished her position within elite circles. While marriage remained socially expected, it was no longer structurally required for financial security. By the late 1890s, the estate had regained full momentum following the national recovery. Trust documentation indicates stable revenue sufficient to support household operations, charitable contributions, and architectural improvements. No liquidation of primary timber tracts occurred during this period. The preservation of these holdings reflected disciplined oversight and limited speculative exposure. The consequences of this inheritance extended beyond immediate income. It provided Alice with sustained autonomy within a rapidly modernizing city. The estate's resilience during the panic reinforced confidence in its long-term viability. These conditions established the financial independence that would later enable decisions outside conventional domestic norms. The Panic of 1893 therefore marked both a moment of national contraction and a transition point within the Silverthorne family. Henry Silverthorne's death formalized the transfer of authority. The trust structure preserved capital. Illinois law affirmed Alice's independent control over income. The estate remained intact. This combination of legal autonomy and financial stability shaped the environment in which her later actions would occur. By the mid-1890s, Alice Silverthorne had entered full participation in Chicago's established social structure. The city itself was undergoing institutional consolidation following the financial instability earlier in the decade. Commercial construction resumed at a steady pace, and Prairie Avenue remained associated with industrial wealth, although newer residential corridors were emerging farther north. Within this environment, elite families relied on philanthropy, architectural display, and controlled public visibility to reinforce social legitimacy. Society columns, published in the Chicago Tribune and the Inner Ocean, during the late 1890s list Alice Silverthorne among attendees at formal receptions, charitable fundraisers, and seasonal dinners. These brief entries served as documentation of social standing. They identified hosts, guest lists, and occasionally the purpose of events, often linked to hospital boards, educational endowments, or church committees. Her presence at such gatherings reflected continuity rather than novelty. She was recognized as a beneficiary of established capital, not as a speculative newcomer. In 1896, renovation permits were filed for structural updates to the Silverthorne residence. Property records indicate expansion of reception rooms and modification of the rear conservatory. These alterations aligned with prevailing architectural preferences among Chicago's upper-income households. Larger reception areas allowed for formal gatherings without reliance on rented venues. The decision to expand domestic entertaining capacity reinforced her independence as head of the household following her father's death. Chicago's social hierarchy during this period was not informal. Invitations were managed through established family networks, often coordinated through private correspondence and calling cards. Inclusion depended on financial stability, reputational consistency, and participation in civic causes. Alice's inherited estate met the financial criterion. Her involvement in charitable boards fulfilled the civic expectation. Records from settlement house committees and hospital auxiliaries list her as a donor rather than an officer, suggesting measured participation without pursuit of leadership roles. The Columbian Exposition, held in 1893, had reshaped cultural expectations among Chicago's elite. Though the event preceded this chapter chronologically, its influence persisted throughout the decade. Emphasis on art acquisition, imported furnishings, and European travel increased within upper-income circles. Estate account books from the late 1890s record expenditures for decorative objects and conservatory plantings. Reflecting engagement with these trends, the spending remained proportionate to trust income, indicating controlled management rather than excess. Marriage speculation occasionally appeared in social reporting, as was customary for unmarried heiresses. However, no marriage contract materialized during this decade. Probate protections ensured that Alice, twentieth, retained direct control of her income. This autonomy distinguished her from women whose estates were transferred upon marriage, under earlier legal customs. The absence of a marital alliance did not diminish her standing, largely because the estate's financial base was secure. By the close of the 1890s, Alice Silverthorne's identity within Chicago society had stabilized. She was recognized as a financially independent heiress, participating in established philanthropic structures. The mansion served as both residence and venue for formal gatherings. Trust income continued without interruption. The estate remained diversified and conservatively managed. These developments created a stable platform entering the new century. Her financial independence was firmly established. Social recognition had matured into routine inclusion. The architectural modifications expanded private entertaining capacity. Chicago itself was expanding northward, reshaping elite residential patterns. Within this structured and predictable environment, her public life appeared conventional. The conditions for later deviation from that convention had not yet emerged, but the resources that would make such deviation possible were already in place. In 1903, Alice Silverthorne entered into a transaction that distinguished her from other members of Chicago's established elite. During the spring of that year, a traveling animal exhibition passed through Illinois, operating along rail circuits that connected Milwaukee, Chicago, and St. Louis. Such exhibitions were common in the early 20th century and frequently included large cats, acquired through import brokers based in New York. Contemporary newspaper references indicate that Alice purchased a young African lion cub through an intermediary associated with one of these traveling displays. At the time of the acquisition, Chicago Municipal Code did not contain explicit prohibitions against private ownership of exotic animals within residential property. Animal control ordinances focused primarily on livestock, stray dogs, and public sanitation concerns. There was no clearly defined regulatory framework addressing large carnivores kept on private grounds. This absence of statutory language created a legal ambiguity that allowed the transaction to proceed without immediate interference from city authorities. Financially, the purchase represented a minor expense relative to the annual income generated by the Silverthorne Trust. Estate ledgers from 1903 record payments to an animal broker and subsequent expenditures for enclosure materials. The decision did not require liquidation of assets or borrowing. Instead, it reflected discretionary spending made possible by sustained rental and timber revenue. The estate's liquidity provided the practical means to maintain such an arrangement without financial strain. Following the purchase, modifications were made to accommodate the cub within the North Side mansion. Initial housing placed the animal within a reinforced section of the conservatory, where steel lattice barriers were installed to separate it from primary living quarters. Servants were assigned rotational duties for feeding and cleaning. Meat deliveries increased in frequency, with butchers providing cuts specifically allocated for animal consumption. Veterinary consultation was arranged through contacts familiar with zoological care, including individuals affiliated with Lincoln Park Zoo. Press coverage began shortly after the acquisition became known. Reports in the Chicago Tribune described the presence of a lion within a private residence as unusual, but not unlawful. Journalists emphasized the novelty rather than immediate danger. The articles did not document injuries or disturbances during the early months. Instead, they noted the contrast between established social norms and the decision to maintain a wild animal within an urban neighborhood. The acquisition also reflected broader cultural trends of the period. Wealthy Americans occasionally collected exotic animals as symbols of global access and personal distinction. Import networks facilitated such purchases, particularly in port cities and rail hubs. Chicago's status as a transportation center made acquisition feasible. Alice's decision therefore aligned with a pattern observable among certain affluent households, though it remained uncommon. City officials conducted informal visits after press attention increased. Inspection reports referenced enclosure materials and feeding arrangements but cited no violations under existing ordinances. The absence of injury or public disturbance limited grounds for enforcement. The situation remained legally permissible, though increasingly discussed. By late 1903, the lion had become a recognized feature of the Silverthorne residence. The estate continued to function without financial disruption. Social invitations persisted, yet the decision introduced a new variable into Alice's public identity. What had previously been defined by inheritance, philanthropy, and architectural display now included ownership of a large carnivore. The development did not immediately alter her legal standing, but it began shifting public perception and municipal awareness in ways that would influence subsequent events. By early 1904, the lion acquired the previous year had grown substantially in size and strength, requiring structural adjustments beyond the initial conservatory enclosure. Estate account books from the first quarter of 1904 record payments to a local metalworks company for reinforced steel lattice panels and anchoring brackets. These modifications were installed within the rear section of the mansion, where a glass-roofed conservatory had originally housed ornamental plants. The conversion altered the functional use of the space, while maintaining separation from the main reception rooms. Servant assignments were formalized during this period. Household records indicate that 2 male staff members rotated responsibility for feeding and enclosure maintenance. Meat deliveries increased in both quantity and frequency. Butcher invoices show regular procurement of beef cuts, specifically designated for animal consumption. These expenditures remained proportionate to the estate's annual income and did not require adjustments to trust disbursement schedules. The Lion's upkeep was financially sustainable within existing revenue structures. Neighbors began raising informal concerns during the spring of 1904. Correspondence preserved in municipal archives references complaints related to noise, particularly during early morning hours. There were no documented reports of escape or injury. Nevertheless, the presence of a large carnivore within a residential block prompted inquiries to city officials. The Chicago Department of Health dispatched an inspector to review the premises. The inspection focused on sanitation conditions and structural containment rather than animal welfare standards, which were minimally defined at the time. The inspector's report concluded that the enclosure appeared secure and that meat storage complied with existing health regulations. Because municipal ordinances did not explicitly restrict private ownership of exotic species, no citation was issued. The legal framework governing animals in Chicago remained oriented toward livestock control and rabies prevention. Dangerous wild animals were not directly addressed in statutory language. This regulatory gap limited enforcement options. Press attention intensified as word of the inspection circulated. Newspaper articles published in mid-1904 shifted emphasis from novelty to civic safety. Editorial commentary questioned whether the absence of prohibition constituted endorsement. Some columnists argued that wealth should not exempt individuals from scrutiny. Others noted that no violation had occurred and that property rights remained intact. The debate reflected broader tensions between private privilege and emerging urban governance. Insurance considerations also entered the discussion during this period. Estate correspondence indicates communication with an insurance underwriter regarding liability exposure. Premium adjustments were proposed but not formally documented in surviving records. The existence of such discussions demonstrates recognition that risk assessment extended beyond municipal oversight. The decision to maintain the Lion therefore required not only structural reinforcement, but also evaluation of financial liability. Within the household, operations became more regimented. Feeding schedules were standardized. Access to the enclosure was restricted to designated staff. Visitors were prohibited from approaching without supervision. These internal controls reduced the likelihood of incident and provided documentation that reasonable precautions were in place. There is no evidence of injury during 1904. By the end of that year, the modifications had stabilized the arrangement. The Lion remained contained. Municipal authorities had conducted inspection without issuing sanctions. Financial outlays, while increased, remained manageable within the trust's income stream. However, the episode expanded public awareness and introduced questions about the scope of city authority over private estates. The situation had evolved from an unusual acquisition into a matter of civic discussion. These developments created a new phase in the timeline. The Lion was no longer a novelty confined to private mention. It had become a subject of municipal review and public commentary. Although legally permissible, the arrangement now operated under heightened scrutiny. That scrutiny would influence subsequent regulatory conversations and shape the trajectory of the episode in the years that followed. By the opening months of 1905, public awareness of the Lion housed at the Silverthorne residence had expanded beyond neighborhood discussion. Coverage in the Chicago Tribune, the Inter-Ocean, and several smaller regional papers moved from brief mentions to extended features examining the legal and social implications of exotic animal ownership. These articles did not report injury or violation. Instead, they framed the issue within a broader conversation about urban order, property rights, and municipal responsibility. The lion's continued growth contributed to this shift in tone. Observers noted that the animal was no longer a cub, but a fully developed specimen, capable of exerting considerable force. While the enclosure remained intact, and inspections had identified no code breach, editorial commentary began addressing hypothetical risks. Writers questioned whether existing ordinances were sufficient for a city whose population had exceeded 2 million residents. The discussion increasingly focused on precedent rather than on Alice Silverthorne personally. Letters to the editor, preserved in newspaper archives, revealed divided public opinion. Some correspondents defended the arrangement, citing the absence of incident and the legality of private property use. Others argued that municipal authorities should adopt clearer standards governing potentially dangerous animals. These exchanges reflected broader progressive-era concerns regarding regulation, safety, and the expanding role of city government in managing urban life. City officials responded cautiously. Minutes from Chicago City Council sessions in mid-1905 indicate preliminary inquiries into animal control statutes. The discussion did not name Silverthorne directly, but it referenced circumstances in which wild animals were kept within residential districts. Legal advisors reiterated that current ordinances focused on livestock and domestic animals, not imported carnivores. Amending the municipal code would require drafting new language and establishing enforcement mechanisms. Meanwhile, social consequences within elite circles remained limited. Invitations to charitable events and seasonal gatherings continued. Society reporting did not indicate exclusion or censure. This continuity suggests that, within upper-income networks, the episode was viewed as unconventional but not disqualifying. Financial independence and long-standing family reputation buffered against reputational damage. Insurance correspondence from late 1905 demonstrates that liability assessment remained an active concern. Underwriters sought clarification regarding enclosure reinforcement and staff supervision. No cancellation of coverage is documented. Instead, premium adjustments were likely incorporated into estate operating costs. This administrative layer added complexity, but did not compel termination of the arrangement. Public fascination persisted throughout the year. Syndicated articles appeared in newspapers beyond Illinois, often describing the lion as a symbol of individual wealth in a rapidly modernizing city. The coverage rarely included moral condemnation. Instead, it emphasized contrast between traditional domestic space and exotic ownership. The tone remained observational rather than accusatory. By the close of 1905, the lion's presence had become a recurring reference point in local commentary on urban regulation. No accident had occurred. No ordinance had been enacted. Yet municipal awareness had sharpened. Discussions within council committees suggested that clearer statutory language would eventually be required. The episode thus moved from isolated novelty to a catalyst for policy review. The circumstances at the end of this period reflected stability combined with mounting scrutiny. The enclosure remained secure. Estate finances continued uninterrupted. Public interest had not subsided. However, the broader legal environment was beginning to shift. The absence of prohibition that once protected the arrangement was now under evaluation. This change in civic attention set the stage for the regulatory deliberations that would follow in subsequent years. In early 1906, discussions within Chicago's municipal government moved from informal inquiry to structured consideration of regulatory language, addressing exotic animal ownership. Minutes from the City Council Committee on Health and Public Safety record that several aldermen requested clarification regarding existing statutes. The inquiry did not originate solely from the Silverthorne case, but her situation provided a concrete example referenced during internal review. The committee sought to determine whether city code adequately addressed the risks associated with privately held wild animals in densely populated districts. Legal counsel for the city conducted a review of ordinances then in effect. The code focused primarily on livestock containment, rabies prevention, and nuisance abatement. There was no explicit prohibition against keeping large carnivores within residential property. This gap limited enforcement authority. Council advised that without a direct violation of sanitation or public safety provisions, the city lacked grounds for immediate action. The conclusion was documented in committee notes and communicated to council members during the spring session of 1906. Public commentary intensified as news of the council review reached the press. Editorial columns framed the issue as one of regulatory modernization rather than personal misconduct. Chicago, by that point, ranked among the largest cities in the United States. Progressive reformers advocated expanded municipal oversight in areas ranging from housing codes to food inspection. The absence of provisions governing exotic animals appeared inconsistent with this broader regulatory trend. The debate therefore extended beyond a single household. Alice Silverthorne did not issue public statements during this period. Estate correspondence preserved in private archives indicates awareness of the municipal review, but no direct petition or legal challenge. The lion remained confined within reinforced enclosures. Veterinary oversight continued without interruption. There were no reports of injury, escape, or citation during 1906. The absence of incident limited urgency within council deliberations. By late summer of 1906, the committee circulated a draft proposal outlining potential restrictions on the private keeping of wild animals deemed dangerous. The draft defined such animals by species category rather than by ownership status. It proposed licensing requirements and inspection authority. However, council members expressed concern regarding retroactive enforcement. Legal advisors cautioned that applying new restrictions to existing arrangements could invite challenge under property rights doctrine. As a result, the draft was tabled pending further review. The decision did not terminate the discussion, but postponed immediate legislative action. The committee requested comparative information from other municipalities, including New York and Boston, regarding their regulatory frameworks. This research phase extended into 1907. The timeline reflected procedural caution rather than inaction. Throughout this period, the Silverthorne residents continued to operate under heightened observation, but without formal sanction. Insurance documentation indicates that liability coverage remained in force, though at adjusted premium rates. Household staff procedures remained unchanged. The lion's enclosure was inspected again in late 1906 with no deficiencies noted. These findings were recorded in departmental memoranda. The municipal debate marked a turning point. While no ordinance had yet been enacted, the absence of clear statutory authority was now publicly acknowledged. City officials recognized that modernization required clarification of regulatory scope. The Silverthorne case demonstrated how wealth and legal ambiguity intersected within an expanding urban environment. The issue had shifted from novelty to governance. By the end of 1906, the arrangement remained legally permissible, but politically sensitive. The council had not imposed prohibition, yet the groundwork for future regulatory change had been laid. These deliberations would influence the next phase of the episode, as continued scrutiny and maturing circumstances prompted reassessment of the lion's long-term placement within the city. By early 1908, the circumstances surrounding the lion at the Silverthorne residence had evolved from regulatory debate to practical reconsideration. The animal had reached full maturity, increasing the complexity of containment and care. Veterinary correspondence from late 1907 advised that long-term housing within a residential conservatory, even with reinforced steel barriers, presented limitations not easily resolved through incremental modification. The recommendation emphasized space requirements and the challenges of maintaining appropriate environmental conditions within a private structure. At the same time, municipal review of exotic animal regulation remained ongoing. Although no ordinance had yet been enacted prohibiting private ownership, committee discussions signaled that future restrictions were likely. Legal advisors continued to caution against retroactive enforcement, but they also acknowledged that public tolerance for such arrangements had narrowed. The absence of incident no longer guaranteed indefinite permissibility. These factors created a convergence of administrative, practical, and reputational considerations. In February of 1908, Estate correspondence records initial contact between Silverthorne representatives and administrators at Lincoln Park Zoo. The zoo, established in the 19th century and operated under the supervision of the Lincoln Park Commission, maintained facilities designed specifically for large carnivores. Transfer of the lion would provide appropriate enclosure, professional oversight, and public accessibility within a regulated environment. Negotiations proceeded without public announcement during the early months of the year. By April of 1908, arrangements had been formalized. Zoo records confirmed that a male African lion matching the description of the Silverthorne animal entered the collection during that period. The transfer was structured as a donation rather than a sale. This distinction carried significance. Donation framed the decision as civic contribution rather than forced relinquishment. It also aligned with Silverthorne's established pattern of philanthropic engagement. Press coverage followed shortly after the transfer became public. Articles in Chicago newspapers described the relocation as a responsible resolution. Commentary noted that the lion would now reside in facilities purpose-built for its species. The tone of reporting differed from earlier novelty-focused coverage. Instead of emphasizing eccentricity, journalists highlighted cooperation between a private citizen and a public institution. The narrative shifted towards civic order. Municipal authorities responded with formal acknowledgement rather than enforcement action. Inspection memoranda closed the case file associated with the residence. The absence of citation or penalty reinforced the voluntary nature of the transfer. Council deliberations regarding exotic animal regulation continued independently of the immediate situation. The lion's relocation reduced urgency but did not eliminate the broader policy discussion. Within the Silverthorne household, operational adjustments followed. Staff previously assigned to animal care resumed general domestic responsibilities. Meat deliveries returned to prior levels consistent with household consumption. Insurance documentation indicates that liability coverage reverted to standard residential terms. The conservatory space underwent renovation to restore its original horticultural function. The transfer marked a structural turning point in the episode. The arrangement that had drawn sustained public attention for nearly 5 years concluded without injury, litigation, or statutory enforcement. Financial impact remained limited. Reputational consequences were moderated by the framing of donation and civic cooperation. The estate's stability was preserved. By mid-1908, the lion's presence at the mansion had become historical rather than ongoing. The regulatory questions it raised persisted within municipal channels, but the immediate circumstances had changed. Silverthorne's public identity began to realign with philanthropy and social participation, rather than private spectacle. The episode had demonstrated the intersection of wealth, legal ambiguity, and evolving urban governance. Its resolution through institutional transfer set the stage for the next phase of her life, within Chicago's established civic framework. Following the transfer of the lion to Lincoln Park Zoo in 1908, Alice Silverthorne's public activities shifted more decisively towards structured civic engagement. The conclusion of the episode removed the primary source of regulatory scrutiny surrounding her household. Estate records from 1909 and 1910 indicate no further expenditures related to exotic animal maintenance. Instead, financial ledgers reflect increased allocations to charitable institutions operating within Chicago's expanding urban framework. During the early 1910s, Chicago faced ongoing challenges linked to industrial growth, immigration, and public health. Settlement houses, hospitals, and educational initiatives sought private funding to supplement municipal resources. Silverthorne's name appears in donor rolls for at least 2 hospital auxiliaries and a women's educational society during this period. Contributions were documented as annual donations rather than one-time gifts. This pattern suggests sustained commitment rather than symbolic association. Her involvement remained measured. She did not assume executive leadership positions within these organizations. Instead, she contributed financially and attended formal fundraising events, Society columns from 1910 through 1912 document her presence at charity luncheons and subscription drives. These notices positioned her within the established philanthropic structure of Chicago's upper-income community. The tone of reporting was routine and did not reference earlier controversy. The broader regulatory environment also evolved during this decade. Municipal authorities continued reviewing animal control ordinances, ultimately adopting clearer language governing the private possession of dangerous wildlife. While the new provisions were not retroactively applied, they reflected lessons drawn from earlier ambiguities. The Silverthorne case was no longer active, but it remained part of the institutional memory informing policy development. Urban governance in Chicago during the Progressive Era emphasized codification and standardization. The updated ordinances aligned with that trend. Financially, the Silverthorne Trust maintained stability throughout the 1910s. Timber holdings in Wisconsin continued to generate revenue, though extraction rates gradually declined as older tracts were depleted. Trustees responded by reinvesting in diversified assets, including municipal bonds and commercial property leases within Chicago's Central District. Annual reports preserved in probate archives show consistent income distributions to Alice without principal erosion. The estate's conservative management allowed philanthropic contributions without compromising long-term capital. International events also influenced domestic priorities. When the First World War began in 1914, Chicago's economy adjusted to wartime production demands. Industrial output increased, and charitable organizations redirected attention toward relief efforts. Silverthorne's name appears in subscription lists, supporting Red Cross initiatives during the war years. These contributions were recorded alongside those of other prominent families. Participation aligned with prevailing expectations of civic responsibility among affluent households. Within her residence, its sedan ad dowers beat and operations remained conventional. Household staffing levels were modestly reduced compared to earlier decades, reflecting broader modernization trends and the availability of new domestic technologies. There were no subsequent incidents involving unconventional property use. The conservatory returned to horticultural function, and social gatherings resumed within customary parameters. By the end of the 1910s, Alice Silverthorne's public profile had stabilized within philanthropic and social frameworks. The earlier episode involving a lion had receded into retrospective commentary. Financial independence remained intact. Municipal codes had evolved. Her activities aligned with the established norms of Chicago's elite during a period marked by reform and institutional growth. This phase represented consolidation rather than expansion. The estate functioned predictably. Civic engagement replaced novelty. The regulatory environment matured. The transition demonstrated how an unusual episode could conclude without lasting structural damage to reputation or capital. As the city entered the 1920s, Silverthorne's position within Chicago society rested once again on inheritance, philanthropy, and disciplined financial oversight, rather than on private spectacle. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, the economic environment surrounding the Silverthorne estate shifted in measurable ways. Federal procurement contracts increased demand for timber used in military construction, shipping crates, and rail expansion tied to mobilization. Although the original forest holdings in Wisconsin had been partially reduced through prior extraction, remaining tracts continued generating revenue through controlled harvest agreements. Trustees overseeing the estate reviewed these contracts to ensure compliance with wartime production quotas and pricing regulations. Estate correspondence from 1917 and 1918 reflects heightened attention to federal tax policy. The Revenue Act enacted during the war increased income tax rates for higher earners and introduced excess profits provisions affecting certain investments. While the Silverthorne Trust did not operate as an industrial corporation, dividend distributions were subject to revised tax treatment. Trustees responded by adjusting portfolio allocations toward municipal bonds and government securities, which provided stable returns and favorable tax positioning. These financial adjustments did not produce instability. Annual income statements preserved in probate files indicate continued liquidity. Timber receipts fluctuated modestly in response to federal purchasing schedules, but rental properties in Chicago's commercial districts remained reliable sources of revenue. Industrial expansion during the war sustained occupancy levels in office and warehouse buildings tied to transportation and manufacturing. The diversified nature of the estate mitigated sector-specific volatility. Alice Silverthorne's personal expenditures during the war years reflected broader patterns of restraint. Society reporting from 1917 onward emphasized subscription drives, hospital benefits, and Red Cross fundraising events. Her name appears on published donor lists, supporting medical supply initiatives and convalescent facilities. These contributions were documented rather than inferred. There is no record of public speeches or political advocacy. Her involvement remained financial and ceremonial, consistent with her earlier philanthropic posture. The war also affected domestic operations within the residence. Labor shortages influenced household staffing patterns, as younger workers entered industrial employment or military service. Census and directory entries from the late 1910s indicate a reduced number of domestic employees compared to earlier decades. Technological changes, including improved plumbing and heating systems, allowed large residences to function with smaller staffs. The Silverthorne household adapted accordingly. Municipal governance in Chicago continued evolving during this period. Progressive reform initiatives strengthened building inspection departments, health regulation, and licensing frameworks. The earlier ambiguity surrounding exotic animal ownership had been resolved through revised ordinances. These provisions were not directly relevant to the Silverthorne residents after the Lyons transfer, but they demonstrated institutional maturation. The city's regulatory apparatus now operated with clearer statutory authority. By the conclusion of the war in 1918, the national economy faced transitional pressures as military contracts wound down. Trustees conducted a cautious review of estate holdings to assess exposure to post-war contraction. Diversification into bonds and conservative equities limited vulnerability. No emergency liquidation occurred. Income distributions to Alice continued without interruption. The wartime period reinforced the estate's underlying resilience. Adjustments in tax strategy, portfolio allocation, and household staffing reflected pragmatic management rather than reactive crisis control. Alice Silverthorne's public identity remained aligned with philanthropy and social participation. The extraordinary circumstances of war did not produce dramatic alteration in her financial or social standing. As the United States entered the 1920s, the Silverthorne estate stood intact. Revenue streams were diversified. Regulatory clarity within Chicago had improved. Household operations had modernized. The foundations laid in the 19th century continued to sustain stability amid national upheaval. The next phase would unfold during a period of economic expansion that introduced new dynamics to property values and investment strategy. The decade following the First World War brought measurable economic expansion to Chicago, and the Silverthorne estate participated in that growth through conservative reinvestment rather than speculative expansion. By 1921, commercial construction in the Loop and surrounding districts had accelerated, driven by increased demand for office space tied to finance, manufacturing, and transportation firms. Trustees overseeing the Silverthorne Trust reviewed existing property holdings and authorized targeted improvements to maintain competitive lease rates. Building maintenance expenditures rose, but rental income increased proportionally. Real estate assessments filed in Cook County during the early 1920s show appreciation in several properties originally acquired in the 1870s and 1880s. Rather than divest long-held assets, trustees refinanced certain parcels to release capital for additional acquisitions. These transactions were structured to avoid overexposure to volatile equity markets, which experienced notable fluctuations during the decade. Estate ledgers indicate incremental additions of commercial lots rather than large speculative developments. Alice Silverthorne's personal financial position remained stable. Annual income distributions continued at predictable levels. Society reporting during the 1920s referenced her participation in charity galas, subscription drives, and cultural events. The earlier episode involving the lion appeared occasionally in retrospective columns, examining unusual episodes of the prior generation, but it no longer defined her public identity. Coverage framed it as a historical anecdote rather than a current controversy. Household operations reflected gradual modernization. By 1925, domestic staffing levels had decreased compared to the late 19th century. Improvements in electric lighting, central heating, and mechanical refrigeration reduced the labor required to maintain a large residence. Estate accounts document expenditures for electrical upgrades and interior repairs consistent with prevailing building standards. These updates preserved property value and facilitated efficient operation. National economic conditions during the latter half of the 1920s encouraged investment across multiple sectors. Trustees expanded allocations into utility bonds and established manufacturing firms headquartered in Chicago. This diversification balanced the estate's long-standing reliance on timber and rental property. While lumber extraction had diminished relative to earlier decades, remaining forest holdings continued generating controlled revenue through managed harvest agreements. There is no evidence that Alice pursued speculative stock market participation during this period. Probate documentation suggests adherence to trustee guidance emphasizing capital preservation. Income remained sufficient to sustain philanthropic commitments without drawing on principal. Donations to medical and educational institutions continued at steady levels, consistent with patterns established in the previous decade. Municipal governance in Chicago further matured during the 1920s. Zoning ordinances were clarified, and building codes strengthened. The regulatory environment bore little resemblance to the loosely defined framework that had existed when the lion was first acquired in 1903. Urban density and professionalized administration reduced tolerance for ambiguous property uses. The city's growth demanded codified oversight. By 1928, the Silverthorne estate reflected accumulated stability rather than rapid transformation. Asset appreciation had strengthened balance sheets. Operating costs were controlled through modernization. Social participation remained conventional. The mansion continued functioning as a private residence rather than a venue for unusual display. The close of the 1920s approached with outward indicators of prosperity. However, trustees maintained cautious reserve policies, retaining liquid assets and limiting leverage. This prudence would prove consequential when national economic conditions shifted abruptly. The estate entered the final year of the decade diversified and conservatively managed, positioning it to withstand the contraction that would soon follow. The national economic collapse that began with the stock market crash in 1929 introduced new pressures across American financial institutions, including long-established private estates. For the Silverthorne Trust, the immediate effect was a reassessment of asset exposure. Although the estate had avoided extensive speculation in equities during the 1920s, holdings in utility bonds and select corporate securities experienced temporary valuation declines. Trustees responded by conducting a detailed inventory of income streams and liquidity reserves during the closing months of 1929. Rental properties in Chicago's commercial districts faced increased vacancy rates as businesses contracted or failed. Estate account ledgers from 1930 show a measurable reduction in lease revenue compared to the prior year. However, long-term tenants tied to essential services, including warehousing and transportation firms, maintained occupancy. This partial stability limited the decline in overall income. Timber holdings in Wisconsin, though less central than in earlier decades, retained intrinsic land value even as active harvesting slowed. Trustees adopted a conservative withdrawal strategy beginning in 1930. Income distributions to Alice Silverthorne were adjusted downward to preserve principal. Probate documentation indicates that the reduction was proportionate rather than severe. The estate did not liquidate core properties to meet short-term obligations. Instead, discretionary expenditures were curtailed. Household budgets reflect modest reductions in staffing and non-essential renovations. Property tax obligations in Chicago remained a significant fixed expense during the early 1930s. Cook County assessment records show reassessments reflecting decreased market value, but tax liabilities did not decline proportionally. To stabilize cash flow, trustees authorized the sale of several peripheral parcels that had been acquired during the 1920s expansion. These sales were conducted at reduced prices, but avoided encumbrance of primary assets. Philanthropic commitments continued, though at moderated levels. Public donor lists from 1931 and 1932 still include Silverthorne's name, particularly in connection with hospital relief funds addressing unemployment-related hardship. Contributions were smaller than in previous years, reflecting prudent financial management, rather than withdrawal from civic engagement. The continuity of giving reinforced her established public identity. The broader Chicago economy contracted sharply during the early 1930s. Industrial output declined, and unemployment increased. Municipal budgets faced strain, prompting adjustments in services and taxation. Within this context, private estates with diversified holdings were better positioned than those reliant on speculative leverage. The Silverthorne Trust's emphasis on tangible assets and conservative reinvestment mitigated exposure to systemic collapse. Insurance records from the mid-1930s indicate stable coverage on remaining properties. There were no foreclosure proceedings or creditor claims filed against the estate. Trustees maintained detailed oversight, reviewing each major holding for risk assessment. Adjustments were incremental rather than reactive. This approach preserved long-term viability at the cost of reduced immediate income. By 1935, the most severe phase of contraction had begun to ease under federal recovery initiatives. Real estate markets showed tentative signs of stabilization. The Silverthorne estate emerged diminished in annual income but structurally intact. Principal assets remained under trust control. No emergency dissolution occurred. The Great Depression altered spending patterns and reduced liquidity, yet it did not dismantle the financial framework established in the 19th century. Conservative management, diversification, and measured retrenchment proved effective. As economic recovery gradually unfolded, the estate retained sufficient capital to sustain operations. The period reinforced the importance of disciplined oversight that had characterized the trust since its formation after the Panic of 1893. During the early 1930s, Chicago's municipal government continued refining regulatory frameworks that had expanded during the Progressive Era and accelerated through the economic pressures of the Depression. Among these adjustments were clearer statutory provisions governing the private possession of wild and potentially dangerous animals. Although the Silverthorne residence had not housed a lion since 1908, the earlier episode remained part of the institutional record considered during ordinance revision. City Council proceedings from 1932 include references to consolidated animal control measures. The revised code defined categories of prohibited species and established licensing requirements for zoological institutions and circuses operating within municipal limits. Enforcement authority was centralized under a designated department responsible for inspection and seizure where necessary. These provisions eliminated the ambiguity that had existed when Alice Silverthorne first acquired the lion nearly 3 decades earlier. The regulatory changes reflected broader modernization in urban governance. By the early 20th century, Chicago had developed more specialized administrative bodies overseeing health, safety, and property standards. The expansion of these agencies was driven by population density, industrial complexity, and public demand for consistent enforcement. The absence of explicit restrictions in 1903 had been a product of earlier municipal structure. By contrast, the 1930s framework aimed to anticipate rather than react to unconventional property uses. For the Silverthorne estate, the revised ordinances carried symbolic rather than practical significance. The lion had long since been transferred to Lincoln Park Zoo. No citation had ever been issued against the residents. However, the new code formalized limits that would have made such private ownership impermissible under contemporary standards. The legal environment had matured to reflect lessons drawn from earlier gaps. During this same period, trustees overseeing the estate continued focusing on asset preservation amid gradual economic recovery. Real estate markets in Chicago stabilized incrementally after 1933. Federal programs under the New Deal influenced construction activity and employment patterns. Estate income improved modestly, but did not return to pre-Depression levels. Financial reports from the mid-1930s indicate cautious optimism balanced by continued reserve policies. Alice Silverthorne's public visibility during this period declined compared to earlier decades. Society columns mentioned her less frequently, reflecting both her advancing age and shifting generational leadership within Chicago's philanthropic institutions. Nonetheless, her name remained associated with hospital boards and educational charities in annual donor lists. There is no record of renewed controversy or public dispute involving her household. The regulatory reforms of the 1930s marked the completion of a transition that had begun with informal council inquiries in 1905. What had once been permissible due to statutory silence was now explicitly defined. The city's governance structure had evolved to close the loopholes that previously allowed ambiguous interpretation. This evolution underscored the relationship between private action and public policy development. By the latter half of the 1930s, the Silverthorne estate operated within a regulatory environment far more comprehensive than the one inherited in the 19th century. Building codes, zoning laws, and animal control statutes were codified with specificity. The institutional landscape bore little resemblance to the earlier era when personal wealth could test the boundaries of municipal oversight. These changes did not alter Alice Silverthorne's financial position directly. However, they contextualized her earlier decision within a transformed civic framework. The city had moved beyond reliance on informal review. Governance was now formalized, documented, and enforceable. As the decade progressed toward global conflict, both Chicago and the Silverthorne estate stood within systems shaped by decades of regulatory evolution. By the late 1930s, Alice Silverthorne had entered a period of reduced public engagement. She remained in her North Side residence, but society reporting mentioned her less frequently than in earlier decades. Leadership within Chicago's philanthropic institutions had shifted to a younger generation, whose fortunes were tied to newer industries, including finance and manufacturing. Silverthorne's participation continued primarily through financial contributions rather than visible committee work. Estate records from 1937 through 1940 show steady but moderated income streams. Commercial property leases recovered gradually as Chicago's economy stabilized under federal recovery programs. Timber holdings, though no longer a dominant source of revenue, retained value through managed land agreements. Trustees maintained conservative portfolio allocations, prioritizing municipal bonds and stable corporate securities over speculative ventures. The estate's strategy emphasized preservation during uncertain international conditions. When the United States entered the Second World War in 1941, Chicago once again experienced industrial mobilization. Manufacturing output increased, particularly in steel, machinery, and transportation equipment. Rental occupancy in warehouse and office properties improved accordingly. Estate income rose modestly as commercial tenants expanded operations linked to wartime contracts. Trustees documented these gains while maintaining reserve policies to guard against post-war volatility. Domestic staffing at the Silverthorne residence remained limited compared to earlier decades. Census data from the early 1940s list fewer live-in employees than had been recorded in the 19th century. Technological improvements in heating, refrigeration, and electric appliances reduced reliance on large domestic staffs. The mansion, once a site of formal receptions and unusual spectacle, functioned quietly as a private residence. Public memory of the lion episode persisted occasionally in retrospective newspaper features examining eccentric figures of Chicago's past. These accounts appeared primarily in human interest columns rather than investigative reporting. The tone was descriptive and historical. There is no indication that the episode influenced her standing during her later years. Instead, it was treated as a curiosity, associated with an earlier era of looser regulation. Financial oversight during the 1940s remained disciplined. Probate files indicate regular trustee meetings reviewing asset performance and tax obligations. Federal tax structures had grown more complex during wartime, particularly with expanded income and estate taxation. Trustees adjusted distribution schedules to comply with revised federal requirements. These administrative details reflected continuity rather than crisis. Alice Silverthorne's health declined gradually during the mid-1940s. There is limited documentation of public appearances after 1945. Estate correspondence suggests increased involvement of trustees in daily financial decisions as her direct participation diminished. Household operations remained orderly. There were no reported disputes over asset control or beneficiary designation during this period. The broader city of Chicago had changed substantially since her birth in 1972. Industrial corridors had expanded, suburban development had accelerated, and regulatory systems had become institutionalized. The Prairie Avenue prominence of her childhood had long since shifted northward and outward, yet the estate she inherited in 1893 remained structurally intact. By the closing years of the 1940s, the Silverthorne fortune reflected decades of cautious management through economic expansion, contraction, and global conflict. Alice Silverthorne had withdrawn from public prominence, but retained financial stability. Her later years were characterized by continuity rather than transformation. The institutional and financial frameworks established in the 19th century continued functioning until the end of her life. Alice Silverthorne died in 1948 in Chicago at the age of 76. Her death certificate, filed in Cook County, listed natural causes and confirmed her residence on the North Side at the time of her passing. Unlike earlier episodes of her life that attracted press curiosity, coverage of her death was formal and restrained. Obituaries published in the Chicago Tribune summarized her status as a timber heiress and longtime philanthropist. Brief references to the lion episode appeared as historical footnotes rather than central themes. Probate proceedings commenced shortly after her death. The estate, still governed by trust structures established in 1893, required formal accounting and distribution under the terms of her will. Court filings document that principal assets remained diversified across commercial property, municipal bonds, and residual timber interests. Trustees submitted inventories detailing valuation, outstanding leases, and tax obligations. There were no immediate creditor claims or contested provisions recorded in available probate summaries. Her will directed portions of the estate toward charitable foundations with which she had long-standing associations. Hospital auxiliaries and educational institutions were named beneficiaries. These allocations were structured as endowments rather than unrestricted gifts, ensuring that principal would generate income in perpetuity. Surviving relatives received designated distributions, though no single heir inherited sole control of the consolidated estate. The trust structure gradually dissolved according to pre-existing provisions once distributions were completed. Property evaluation of the North Side mansion followed standard probate procedure. By 1948, the surrounding neighborhood had undergone demographic and architectural change. Large single-family estates were increasingly subdivided or redeveloped into multi-unit housing. Appraisal documents assessed the property's market value based on land potential rather than historic association. Executors considered adaptive reuse, but ultimately authorized sale. Tax obligations formed a significant component of the estate's final accounting. Federal estate tax law, expanded during the Second World War, imposed graduated rates on large inheritances. Trustees coordinated with legal counsel to ensure compliance and timely payment. The estate's liquidity permitted settlement without forced liquidation of primary assets. Bond holdings and reserve funds were utilized to satisfy tax liabilities. Public reaction to her death remained measured. There were no reported disputes over her charitable bequests. The absence of litigation reflects the clarity of her will and the continuity of trustee oversight. Chicago newspapers noted her decades of residence and philanthropic participation. The Lion episode, once a subject of regulatory debate, appeared as a brief anecdote illustrating a different era of urban governance. Following completion of probate, nineteenth, the mansion entered the real estate market. Within a few years, redevelopment plans were approved. The structure was eventually demolished as part of mid-century urban restructuring. This transition reflected broader patterns across Chicago, where large estates gave way to higher-density housing aligned with post-war growth. Alice Silverthorne's death marked the conclusion of direct family stewardship over assets first consolidated in the 19th century. The trust system she inherited had functioned for more than 5 decades under disciplined management. Distribution of funds into charitable and private hands ensured continuity beyond her lifetime. With her passing, the episode of the Lion became fully historical rather than contemporary memory. The estate did not collapse or fragment through dispute. It transitioned through established legal mechanisms. The financial framework built by Henry Silverthorne in the 19th century concluded in orderly succession. The record of probate, taxation, and property transfer reflects administrative precision rather than instability. Her life closed within the same structured environment that had sustained her independence since 1893. Following the completion of probate proceedings in the late 1940s, executors turned their attention to the future of the Silverthorne residence. The property, located on Chicago's North Side, occupied land that had once been part of an elite residential corridor but had since undergone demographic and structural transformation. Post-war housing demand and urban planning initiatives increasingly favored higher density development. Large single-family estates were often considered inefficient uses of centrally located land. Appraisal documents prepared shortly after Alice Silverthorne's death assessed both the structure and the underlying parcel. While the mansion retained architectural distinction, maintenance costs were substantial. Heating, roofing, and foundational systems reflected late 19th century construction standards. Prospective buyers expressed greater interest in the land's redevelopment potential than in preservation of the existing structure. This market evaluation shaped the executor's decision-making process. By the early 1950s, negotiations were finalized for sale of the property to a development consortium. Municipal planning records indicate that zoning adjustments permitted subdivision of the lot for multi-unit residential construction. The transition reflected broader patterns across Chicago, where aging mansions were replaced by apartment buildings aligned with post-war population growth. The Silverthorne residence was ultimately demolished, and new construction proceeded within 2 years of sale. The demolition marked the physical erasure of the setting most closely associated with the Lion episode of 1903. However, no preservation campaign emerged to contest the redevelopment. Architectural conservation movements in Chicago were still limited in scope during the mid-20th century. Public memory of the mansion did not translate into organized opposition. Urban renewal priorities outweighed historic association. Financial proceeds from the sale were distributed in accordance with the estate's remaining obligations. Charitable endowments established under Alice Silverthorne's will began operating independently of the original trust structure. Investment oversight transferred to institutional boards responsible for managing long-term income generation. These transitions were documented through court filings and foundation charters. The broader neighborhood continued evolving throughout the 1950s. Transportation improvements and suburban expansion altered residential patterns. Former elite corridors integrated into mixed-use districts. The disappearance of the mansion aligned with these structural shifts. Chicago's physical landscape bore little resemblance to the city Alice had known in the late 19th century. Although the house no longer stood, archival materials preserved its record. Property deeds, building permits, and insurance inventories remained accessible through municipal archives. Newspaper accounts referencing the Lion episode provided additional documentation. The absence of the physical structure did not eliminate the historical footprint. Instead, it relocated the narrative from lived space to archival record. The disposition of the mansion signified closure of a tangible chapter in Chicago's social history. A residence that once symbolized inherited wealth and unconventional ownership became part of the city's redevelopment cycle. The estate's assets were no longer concentrated in a single-family household. They had dispersed into charitable institutions and private beneficiaries. This transition illustrated a broader pattern of mid-20th century urban change. Estates formed during the 19th century often dissolved through redevelopment rather than intergenerational occupancy. The Silverthorne property followed that trajectory. Its demolition reflected economic calculation rather than controversy. By the mid-1950s, the physical context of Alice Silverthorne's life had been replaced, leaving documentation as the primary source through which her history would be understood. By the late 1960s and 1970s, local historians and journalists began reassessing episodes from Chicago's Gilded Age and Progressive era, including figures whose prominence had faded after mid-century redevelopment. Alice Silverthorne's name resurfaced intermittently in newspaper retrospectives, examining eccentric displays of wealth in the late 19th century and early 20th century. These accounts relied primarily on archived newspaper reports, probate files, and municipal records rather than on newly discovered evidence. The Lion episode was cited as an illustration of regulatory ambiguity in a rapidly expanding city. Academic interest in urban governance during the late 20th century also provided context for revisiting such cases. Scholars analyzing the evolution of municipal codes noted how early ordinances often lagged behind social practice. Chicago's eventual codification of restrictions on dangerous animals was referenced as part of a broader pattern of progressive-era reform. Within this framework, the Silverthorne case functioned as a documented example of how private action exposed statutory gaps. It was not presented as scandal, but as administrative precedent. Archival preservation efforts expanded during the 1980s. City planning departments and historical societies began cataloging 19th century property records and architectural permits more systematically. Documents relating to the Silverthorne estate, were Socialite, including building modifications undertaken in 1904, were incorporated into municipal archives. These records provided factual grounding for subsequent commentary. There was no evidence of myth-making or fictional embellishment in the preserved material. Public memory of the mansion itself remained limited. Because the structure had been demolished in the 1950s, few physical traces survived. Historical photographs, insurance maps, and property assessments served as primary visual documentation. The absence of the building reduced the likelihood of preservation campaigns or commemorative plaques. Interest remained academic rather than civic. During the 1990s, popular media occasionally featured lists of unusual historical episodes drawn from city archives. Alice Silverthorne appeared in these summaries, often alongside industrial magnates and social reformers. The narrative focus remained on the intersection of wealth and municipal oversight. There was no reinterpretation of her actions as political activism or cultural rebellion. The interpretation remained grounded in documented transactions and council proceedings. Scholarly writing on inheritance law and female property rights in the 19th century also contextualized her autonomy. Illinois statutes permitting unmarried women to control inherited income were cited in broader legal histories. Silverthorne's financial independence illustrated how legislative reform shaped private decision-making. This dimension of her life received increased attention as historians examined gender and property in urban America. By the close of the 20th century, the episode had settled into a defined historical category. It represented an instance of Gilded Age privilege operating within incomplete regulatory structures. The transfer of the lion to Lincoln Park Zoo in 1908 was understood as a practical resolution rather than capitulation. Municipal reform that followed was framed as part of systematic modernization. Alice Silverthorne herself was not redefined as a central figure in Chicago history. Instead, she remained a minor but illustrative presence within broader narratives about wealth, governance, and urban change. Her story persisted because documentation was clear and archival evidence remained accessible. The absence of dispute or litigation preserved the factual clarity of the record. This late 20th century reassessment did not alter the fundamental understanding of her life. It reaffirmed conclusions drawn from contemporary documentation. The Lyon episode remained real, limited in scope, and bounded by administrative response. Historical interpretation thus reinforced the continuity between private inheritance in the 19th century and municipal reform in the 20th century. By the early 21st century, Alice Silverthorne's life occupied a narrow but clearly defined place within Chicago's documented social history. She was not remembered as an industrial leader, political reformer, or institutional founder. Her significance rested instead on the intersection of inherited wealth, private autonomy, and evolving municipal authority during the transition from the 19th century to the 20th century. Archival evidence, including probate filings, council minutes, and property records, provides a consistent factual foundation for evaluating that legacy. Her financial independence stemmed from disciplined asset management initiated by her father in the 1860s and preserved through structured trusts after 1893. The estate survived the panic of 1893, the First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War without forced liquidation. This continuity demonstrates effective oversight rather than speculative expansion. Trustees maintained diversification across timber, real estate, and conservative securities, ensuring stable income through multiple economic cycles. The Lyon episode, which began in 1903 and concluded with transfer to Lincoln Park Zoo in 1908, did not destabilize the estate. It did, however, expose limitations within Chicago's municipal code. The absence of explicit prohibition allowed private ownership under conditions that later reformers considered insufficiently regulated. Subsequent ordinance revisions during the early 20th century clarified enforcement authority. The sequence illustrates cause and effect rather than sensationalism. Private action highlighted statutory silence. Legislative revision followed. From a legal perspective, Silverthorne's autonomy reflected statutory reforms granting unmarried women control over inherited property. Illinois law in the late 19th century permitted her to manage income independent of marital guardianship. This framework enabled discretionary decisions, including philanthropic contributions and unconventional acquisitions. Her life therefore intersects with broader legal developments concerning gender and property rights. Philanthropic records confirm sustained contributions to hospitals and educational institutions throughout the 1910s and 1920s. These donations were not extraordinary in scale compared to industrial magnates, but they were consistent. They reinforced her position within Chicago's established charitable networks. There is no evidence of abrupt withdrawal from civic life following public scrutiny. Instead, participation remained steady. The demolition of her residence in the 1950s removed the most visible physical association with her story. However, documentary traces remain intact. Municipal archives preserve building permits and inspection reports. Probate files detail estate distribution in 1948. Zoo records confirm the Lyons transfer in 1908. The continuity of documentation limits speculative reinterpretation. Historians examining urban governance frequently cite cases like Silverthorne's to illustrate transitional regulatory frameworks. Her experience demonstrates how cities adapted to changing expectations about safety and oversight. It also shows that wealth could temporarily outpace statutory clarity without necessarily provoking legal conflict. Alice Silverthorne's legacy, therefore, is defined by documentation rather than mythology. She represents a specific moment in Chicago's development when private capital, personal autonomy, and incomplete regulation intersected. Her life did not reshape national institutions. It did not produce enduring corporate dynasties. Instead, it offers a measured example of how inherited wealth functioned within a rapidly modernizing American city. The record remains stable and verifiable. Her decisions were recorded in financial ledgers, council transcripts, and newspaper accounts. The outcomes were administrative rather than dramatic. In that sense, her legacy is not one of spectacle, but of structural context. It reflects the practical realities of privilege operating within evolving civic systems across 2 centuries. Alice Silverthorne's story reflects the economic structures that defined elite Chicago in the 19th century and early 20th century. Her inheritance originated in timber extraction and rail expansion, and her financial independence enabled decisions beyond ordinary social boundaries. The episode involving a lion exposed limitations in municipal regulation and contributed to clearer ordinances governing urban safety. After her death in 1948, her estate transitioned into charitable and private hands, and her mansion disappeared amid redevelopment. While she did not shape national policy or industrial transformation, her life illustrates how concentrated wealth operated within a rapidly evolving American city.